The first thing you notice about Kaveth Junction is the smell. Not bad, not good, just layered and dense and impersonal. The way old transit hubs always smell when they have processed enough species over enough decades that no single biology dominates the air anymore. Coolant fluid and recycled atmosphere, and something organic I could never name. Something that sits at the back of the throat like mineral water left too long in a metal flask. I had been through 12 stations in the last 4 years, and they all had their own version of it. Kaveth's was particular. It had weight to it. You breathed it in, and you understood immediately that this was a place where nobody had ever stopped intending to stay. I didn't intend to stay either. 47 hours minimum to departure, Gate 9 on the upper concourse, and 4 hours already burned through finding a bench that didn't have a puddle of something beneath it, and getting Pip documented through the civilian companion registry. That last part had taken 2 hours on its own. The registry officer, a young merit clerk with 7 fingers on each hand, and the kind of permanent exhaustion in her eyes that comes from processing too many forms, had looked at Pip for a long time before stamping the permit. "Is it aggressive?" she'd asked, standard question, they always asked it. "She's a Border Collie," I said, which wasn't exactly an answer, but it was the truest thing I could think of. The clerk stamped the permit and didn't ask a follow-up. I didn't blame her. When you work a transit companion registry, you probably learn very quickly which questions are worth the paper they require. Pip sat beside my left boot with her chin on her paws and watched the clerk the entire time. Not staring, just watching. That is the thing about Border Collies that is very difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived with one. They watch. All of them do, all day long, but it doesn't feel like the watching a dog does when it wants something from you. It feels like inventory, like she is cataloging the world and quietly updating a ledger that you will never be permitted to read. I have had her 9 years. Her dam was my daughter's dog, and when my daughter relocated to the outer settlement, I ended up with the pup. That was the story anyway. The real story was that Pip had decided, before she was 6 months old, that I was her project, and the logistics of my daughter's move had simply been a convenient excuse for all parties to acknowledge what was already true. Pip managed me. She managed the property when we had it. She managed the 2 horses after the Haverson mare died, which is a thing horses need more than most people realize. A dog who will hold the shape of the herd steady when the shape has changed. She managed them both without ever being asked, without any cue beyond her own sense of how things were supposed to be organized. My daughter had named her Pip because at 6 weeks she had been the smallest of the litter. This had been accurate at 6 weeks. By 6 months it was a name that meant something different from what it had originally meant, the way names sometimes drift. Pip at 6 months was not small in any way that mattered. She was decisive. She was precise. She had opinions about the organization of everything within her awareness, and the opinions were correct often enough that I had stopped questioning them and started treating them as the second data source they actually were. She was 11 now. There was gray around her muzzle, and her left rear knee gave her trouble on cold mornings, but her eyes were the same eyes they had always been, clear and dark and thinking. I found us a bench near the central concourse on level 2. Good sightlines, open to the main transit artery in both directions, back to a support column, food concession off to the left. Old habit. I had spent enough years in Survey Corps doing ground assessments of new stations to know that a good bench was a bench where you could see everybody coming and your back wasn't exposed. The Corps had spent considerable effort teaching us how to do that. You spent enough time surveying corridors and stations that were new and undocumented, environments where the threat profile was, by definition, incomplete, and you either learned to position yourself well or you had problems. I had not had many problems in 22 years. Some of that was competence. Some of it was positioning. And some of it in the last 9 years was Pip, who had a talent for choosing the right corner of a room that I had come to trust more than I trusted my own assessment when the two disagreed. Pip had spent 9 years reinforcing the habit. I sat. She settled beside my boot. I opened my kit bag and pulled out the paperwork for the resettlement permit on Vethara Station, the actual reason I was in transit, and started reading the supplementary clauses for the third time because I had a suspicion that Clause 9 had a carve-out in it that the resettlement officer hadn't explained, and that suspicion was proving correct the more I read it. The resettlement was straightforward in theory. I had done my 22 years. I had drawn down my Survey Corps entitlements in good standing. I had a parcel allocated on Vethara Station's agricultural ring, a working assignment, not retirement leisure, because I was not built for retirement leisure and had known this about myself well before I filed the application. I was going to farm. A modest operation, 40 hectares of the upper ring's alluvial basin, a modest dwelling structure already standing, room for a small herd and a working dog. The permit process was supposed to be straightforward. The permit process had 8 supplementary clauses, and at least 2 of them were not straightforward. The concourse was busy. Mid-shift on Kaveth Junction was always busy. I knew that from the pre-transit briefing, because Kaveth sat at the intersection of 3 major corridor routes and functioned as a secondary sorting point for 7 separate cargo lanes. About 12,000 beings moved through it every standard day. The species composition shifted by shift, and I couldn't identify all of them. Some I had never encountered in survey. Some I'd encountered only in threat assessments that were marked restricted. Mostly it was a familiar enough mix. Merit, Sathai, a couple of Yonic trading groups, some beings I thought might be Draven or a close relative. There were a few Korathi, which I noted without particular interest. Korathi were large and loud, and tended to commandeer the food concessions by sheer presence, but they were harmless to anyone not carrying Korathi-specific trade goods. I wasn't carrying any. I had spent enough time in multi-species environments to have stopped being surprised by the variety of biology that moved through a busy hub. You saw things at transit stations that you would not see anywhere else, species that existed at the extreme margins of galactic cartography. Travelers whose biology was so different from anything I had a framework for that I could not have told you with confidence which end was the front. You stopped cataloging the unusual and started cataloging the concerning, which was a different exercise entirely. The Korathi were large, but they weren't concerning. The Yonic group were louder than any Yonic group I had encountered previously, but that appeared to be a cultural expression rather than a threat signal. The concourse, taken as a whole, was running at the particular frequency of a busy transit hub. Loud, impersonal, nobody's particular problem. Pip tracked them all. Slow, systematic, left to right and back. Her chin stayed on her paws. Her tail made small movements, not the full arc of a happy tail, just the slight side-to-side of a dog who is awake and paying attention and filing things. I knew that tail pace well. It meant she had a complete picture of everything within 40 meters and was simply updating it on a rolling basis, the way a good surveyor refreshes a grid. Mark a position, move to the next, circle back. Never let the perimeter go stale. I kept reading Clause 9. The Kaveth arrived at the station somewhere around the 2nd hour. I didn't notice them immediately because I was working through a footnote that referenced a secondary permit category I hadn't applied for, the kind of thing that could derail a resettlement claim for 6 months. And because the Kaveth moved through crowds the way water moves through a drainage channel, without appearing to exert themselves, without friction, without anything that would draw the eye until suddenly you realize the drainage channel is the only path available. I became aware of them because Pip's tail stopped. Not because she growled, she didn't growl. Not because she moved, she didn't move. Her chin stayed on her paws and her posture didn't change in any way I could have described to someone who hadn't spent 9 years reading her. But the small rhythmic side-to-side of her tail went still, and I had learned in 9 years that this specific stillness was Pip shifting from passive monitoring to active cataloging. Something had entered the range that required more than a rolling update. Something required the full ledger to be opened. I looked up from the permit clause. There were 4 of them. Kaveth are not enormous by galactic standards. They run lean, about shoulder height to a tall human, bilateral with a forward-bent knee joint that gives them a particular crouching quality even when they are standing upright. Their coloring in the concourse light was dark mottled gray-brown, almost like old bark that has weathered several seasons, with a bioluminescent strip along the lateral jawline that shifts color depending on their biochemical state. I knew the color states from the threat assessment briefings: amber for neutral transit, pale blue for social signaling, deep red for active predation mode. The 4 of them were running amber, which meant they were not technically in violation of the station's Covenant of Presence agreements. But amber, for a Kaveth hunting pack in a transit hub, was also the color they run when they are selecting, when they are still deciding, when the conclusion has not yet been finalized. They were moving slowly through the concourse in a loose configuration that looked casual until you mapped it. The 2 on the outside were tracking the crowd. The 2 in the middle were tracking me. I knew the behavior from briefings. Kaveth packs operated as a unit with distributed attention. The outer pair maintained situational awareness while the inner pair fixed targeting. They were hunters, not pirates, not territory enforcement. Hunters the way that word means something specific when you use it carefully. They ran prey-selection protocols the way a working dog runs a herding check. Systematic, quiet, low drama until the decision was made. The decision, when it was made, was permanent. In the 3 years since Kaveth Junction had opened to expanded multi-species transit, the Kaveth had been involved in 41 documented transit incidents, which was the station's diplomatic phrasing for what were, functionally, predations. Every single incident had involved a solitary or paired traveler presenting as low status. Alone, no visible affiliations, no escort. The station authority had filed 17 formal complaints with the Kaveth Territorial Council and received 17 formal acknowledgments that had not changed anything. The complaints were on record. The incidents continued. I was a solitary traveler, retired, no affiliation patches on my civilian jacket. No escort, no diplomatic credentials, nothing that would read on a Kaveth assessment scan as affiliated with any protective hierarchy. I was reading permit paperwork. I was, by any reasonable Kaveth assessment, the most prey-shaped thing on the level 2 concourse at that moment. I folded the permit paperwork and put it in my kit bag. Pip's head came up. She had not stood. She had not made a sound. She had simply lifted her chin off her paws and brought her head up to a neutral position, and her eyes, those clear, dark, thinking eyes, had fixed on the inner pair of the Kaveth hunting formation. I had not told her to do this. I had not given her any signal that I was aware of. She had read the change in my posture when I folded the paperwork. I would guess that is what triggered it, because Pip had always been as attuned to my body as she was to anything else in her immediate environment, and she had made her own assessment and adjusted accordingly. She did not bark. She did not growl. She did not show her teeth. She sat up straight on the bench beside my left boot, her front feet placed neatly together on the bench surface, and she looked at the inner pair of the Kaveth hunting pack with the specific quality of attention that I can only describe as the way she looked at livestock that had gotten confused about where the boundary of the field was. Patient, complete, not threatening, simply a statement of fact about how things were organized. The inner pair slowed. I watched this without visible reaction. I put my hand on my kit bag and rested it there. I didn't stand up. Survey Corps had spent considerable time teaching us that you do not stand up until you are ready to go somewhere, because standing up is information, and information given early is information given to the opposition. I sat. My hand was on the kit bag. That was all. The Kaveth moved closer. They did this in the way they did everything, without urgency, without anything that would read as overt aggression to the concourse cameras. The 2 outer hunters had widened their arc, which closed off the two most direct departure angles from my bench. A casual observer would not have read it as closure. They would have read it as two beings walking in a wide radius because the concourse traffic made a straight line inefficient. I read it as closure because I had been taught to read it as closure. The inner pair had reduced their distance from roughly 20 meters to about 12. Their jaw strips were still amber, technically. But amber up close is not a neutral color. It has variations in it that you don't notice from far away. I want to be accurate about what I was doing during this period. I was not frozen. I was not frightened, exactly, though I was alert in the specific way that 22 years of working in variable threat environments produces. A kind of heightened quiet that isn't fear and isn't bravado, just the body running at an elevated attention setting while the mind stays as clear as it can. I had a departure vector to the left if I needed it, past the food concession, and toward the transit platform that led up to level 3. I had a secondary vector along the support column if the first was closed off. Neither of them were good options with a dog in tow. Moving draws the predation response forward, and moving fast confirms prey status, but having them identified was better than not having them. You always want to know where the door is even if you don't intend to use it. What I was mostly doing was watching the inner pair and watching Pip, alternating my attention between them, reading both sets of signals simultaneously. The inner pair was telling me the approach was still in the assessment phase. Pip was telling me she had a complete picture of all four of them and had filed it and was updating it on a continuous basis. Neither piece of information was, on its own, sufficient. Together, they gave me enough to hold position and wait. Pip tracked the outer pair, then the inner pair, then the outer pair again. She wasn't hurting them. I want to be clear about this because the comparison is tempting and it is also wrong. What she was doing was not hurting. Hurting is directional. It has an objective. It involves pressure applied to produce specific movement. It is a conversation between dog and animal conducted in the language of position and eye and the threat of approach. What Pip was doing was something simpler and in some ways more fundamental. She was counting them. She was marking their positions. She was, in the precise language of a dog who had spent 9 years organizing a farm, noting where everything was and holding it in her attention the way you hold a fence line, constantly, without effort, without needing to think about it. She already knew the fence line. She was simply monitoring whether anything had wandered through it. The outer hunters had not expected to be monitored. This was my read afterward. The behavioral pattern I had seen described in briefings, and that, as far as I could tell, every prior Kaveth approach on this station had followed, involved the outer pair maintaining pure situational awareness, watching the crowd for intervention risk, watching the exits for timing, watching the ambient movement of the concourse for anything that would complicate the selection. They were not accustomed to being watched back. They were accustomed to being part of the environment, anonymous in transit, indistinguishable from the general flow of beings moving through a busy hub. They were accustomed to their own gaze being one way. Pip's gaze was not one way. It was a catalog, it was a count. It was the gaze of an animal that had already organized everything within its awareness into a coherent picture, and was simply maintaining the picture's accuracy as the elements moved. The outer hunters were in the picture. They had been placed in the picture the moment they entered Pip's range, and the picture was current and precise, and it did not have gaps in it. I watched one of the outer hunters turn its head slightly. It was a small movement. The forward bent knee joint shifted half a degree and then shifted back. Nothing a transit camera would flag, nothing a casual observer would notice. But the movement had the quality. I had spent enough years reading species. I wasn't built to read to have some rough feel for this. Of an animal that has just realized it is not anonymous. The inner pair had continued their approach. They were at about 10 meters now. I could see the jaw strips with full clarity, and the amber had a quality to it that was almost red-orange at the edges. The assessment phase was ending. The selection phase was beginning. One of them, the pack's primary assessment hunter, the one that leads the final selection call, turned its full attention to Pip. Kaveth's eyes are wide-set and forward-oriented, which is the eye placement of a hunting animal, and they are a pale yellow-green that seems to collect light rather than reflect it. When a Kaveth looks at something with full attention, it looks the way a scope looks through glass. There is a quality of penetration to it that has nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with the physiological apparatus of an animal that evolved to parse the exact physical state of potential prey. Every element of the animal in front of it, posture, micro-tremor, pupil dilation, the specific metabolic chemistry of stress versus composure, gets read and processed and filed in a hierarchy of threat and edibility. It looked at Pip. Pip looked back. And here is the thing I have tried to find the right words for since it happened. What Pip did when she looked back was nothing. There was no display. There was no tension in her. No hackle raise, no stillness of the pre-lunge variety, no physical communication of threat. She just looked at the Kaveth assessment hunter with those clear, dark eyes, and the looking was absolute. It was the looking of an animal that has complete information about everything in its immediate environment and finds none of it surprising and none of it concerning, and is simply waiting to see what the environment decides to do next. Not because it doesn't care, because it already knows. I have seen Pip look at a horse that was about to bolt. I have seen her look at a storm front moving in from the east when I hadn't noticed the pressure change yet. I have seen her look at a Survey Corps officer who had, in my estimation, made a serious error in his threat weighting and was about to learn why. She always looked the same way. Calm. Complete. In possession of facts the subject had not yet assessed. The look of a dog who has been doing this her whole life and has never once doubted the outcome. The Kaveth assessment hunter held the eye contact. Held it. The jaw strip shifted. Amber to something paler. I didn't have the exact calibration in my head. The threat assessment briefing had been 2 years ago and I hadn't refreshed it, but pale was not red. Pale was not the continuation of the predation sequence. Pale was something else entirely. Something the briefing hadn't given me a clean category for. I found out later, when I consulted the xenobiology compact I kept in my kit bag, and should have been reading more carefully all along. That pale in a Kaveth jaw strip is the color they produce in the presence of an apex deer animal. Not threat assessment pale, not territorial warning pale, recognition pale. The color their bioluminescent strip produces when their biology has processed the information that the animal they are looking at is not prey tier, is not even the same tier as they are, is something that the Kaveth hunting pack selection protocols do not have a prepared response for, because for the entirety of the Kaveth's evolutionary history, the animals that produced this response had not been small and gray-muzzled and sitting on a transit bench. The pale held for about 4 seconds. Then one of the outer pair took a step back. Not a deliberate retreat, not the kind you make when you have made a considered decision to withdraw, the kind your legs make before you have made a decision at all. One step back, weight shifting, the forward crouch of the Kaveth standing posture easing by a degree that was small but that I noticed because I was watching very carefully. The outer hunter took the step and then seemed to recognize that it had taken it and held its position, but it did not step forward again. Pip did not react to this. She tracked it, she filed it, she continued looking at the assessment hunter. The assessment hunter looked away. This took approximately 11 seconds from the point of first full eye contact. I say approximately because I had no timer running and was relying on my own sense of elapsed time, which is moderately reliable but not precise. 11 seconds. The assessment hunter looked away, not in the sharp, deliberate way of an animal breaking off a confrontation, but in the slower, quieter way of an animal that has completed its assessment and arrived at a conclusion it did not expect. It looked away to the left. It looked at the inner pair. It looked at something on the far end of the concourse that was, as far as I could tell, Nothing in particular. Its jaw strip went pale all the way. The second member of the inner pair had been watching this exchange. I don't know what communication channel they used. No sound I could detect, no touch signal, nothing I could observe. But the second inner pair hunter shifted its weight back within 3 seconds of the assessment hunter's conclusion, and the outer pair widened their arc almost simultaneously. Widened, not tightened. The closing movement of the pack had reversed. Pip watched them go. Because they went. That is the simple truth of it. They went. The 4-unit Kaveth hunting pack that had been responsible for 7 of the last 12 documented transit incidents on Level 2 of Kaveth Junction simply reversed their approach and moved away down the concourse in the direction of the cargo processing level. No confrontation. No escalation. No display beyond the jaw strip sequence I had already described. They were there and then they weren't, and the concourse closed behind them the way water closes behind a stone. Smoothly, without a mark. Pip watched them until they were out of her sightline. Then her head came down and her chin went back on her paws, and her tail made the small side-to-side movement that meant she had updated the ledger and filed the entry, and was ready for whatever came next. I took my hand off the kit bag. I sat there for a moment without doing anything. I am not someone who processes events out loud or makes observations about them while they are still happening. Survey Corps will cure you of that if you weren't cured already. But there was a specific quality of quiet that had descended on the bench and the 20 feet around it, and I sat in it for a moment and let it settle before I did anything else. The concourse had not noticed. That was the thing about a busy transit hub. It absorbs events. The 12,000 beings moving through Kaveth Junction on any given standard day had their own trajectories, their own concerns, their own assessments of what was worth attending to. A 4-unit Kaveth pack that had approached a bench and then departed without incident did not register on the concourse's general awareness as anything noteworthy. They had not escalated to the level that would have drawn attention. The resolution had happened below the threshold of observation, at the level of biology and gaze, and the precise language of a dog who knew how to end a conversation before it became a confrontation. Nobody had screamed. Nobody had filed an alert. The concourse cameras had captured, at most, a minor gathering of beings near a bench that had dispersed without incident. That would be the official record if anyone looked. It would say nothing and it would be accurate and it would tell exactly none of the truth. Then I opened the kit bag, pulled out the permit paperwork, and found the footnote I had been reading. It said what I had suspected. There was a carve-out. I was going to need to file a supplemental amendment before the resettlement process could proceed. I made a note in the margin. It was fixable. Annoying, but fixable. Pip's tail moved. I looked down at her. "Good girl," I said. She already knew this. She did not require the confirmation, but she took it anyway, with the quiet patience of someone accepting payment for a service they would have rendered regardless of the fee. I should explain what I mean when I say I didn't understand what had just happened. Or rather, I understood the mechanical sequence of it clearly enough. I had watched it happen from 3 feet away. But the significance of what I had watched took time to fully arrive at, the way the significance of large things often takes time. You see the event. The meaning comes in later at its own pace and doesn't ask permission. I had served in the Survey Corps for 22 years. Not combat survey. I want to be clear about that, because people hear Survey Corps and sometimes think of the expansion force versions, the ones with full armament and tactical support. My survey work was ground documentation, new corridor openings, station feasibility assessments, planetary habitability surveys for the settlement office. We carried sidearms because the regulation required it, and because some environments required it, but in 22 years I had fired mine in a non-drill context exactly twice, and both times were wildlife incidents that could have been avoided with better pre-survey intelligence. I was not a soldier. I was a man who spent a great deal of time taking measurements in environments that were not designed for me. Survey work gave you a particular kind of patience. You spent a great deal of time waiting in environments where the appropriate response to an uncertain situation was to wait, observe, and collect more information before acting. You developed a tolerance for ambiguity that people who had spent their careers in more structured environments sometimes found difficult to understand. You also developed a fine-grained awareness of the difference between uncomfortable and dangerous, because those two states feel similar and produce similar physiological responses, but they require completely different decisions. A great deal of the core early field training was, when you stripped away the technical vocabulary, about learning to tell those two things apart under pressure. But you learn things in that work beyond the training. You learn how to read a room that is not a human room. You learn the weight of different kinds of silence. The silence of an environment that has decided to leave you alone, and the silence of an environment that is still deciding. You learn to distinguish between a space that is neutral and a space that is waiting, and you learn to take the latter seriously even when you cannot name the specific source of the waiting. You develop, over 2 decades of working in unfamiliar environments with variable threat profiles, an instinct for the shape of a threat before it declares itself, what it looks like in the approach phase, how it moves when it thinks it is not observed, what it does with its attention, and whether that attention is the attention of indifference or the attention of interest. The Kaveth pack on level 2 of Kaveth Junction had been a textbook approach. I had recognized it within about 40 seconds of their entry into my attention radius. The arc widening of the outer pair, the target fixing of the inner pair, the reduced distance drift that looked like casual transit movement but had the specific, unhurried quality of a movement that has already calculated its endpoint. I had recognized it, and I had made the correct procedural responses. Folded the paperwork, hand on the kit bag, didn't stand up, didn't engage, gave them nothing readable from my posture that would accelerate their timeline. What I had not planned was Pip. This is not because I had forgotten about Pip. You don't forget about an 11-year-old Border Collie sitting on a bench beside your left boot. But my planning for the Kaveth approach had been organized along human threat management lines: minimize information leakage, assess departure vectors, wait for the right moment to change position. Standard survey training. Reasonable. The plan that a reasonable person with reasonable training would execute. What I had not accounted for, because there was no way to account for it using the frameworks I had been given, was that Pip would conduct her own assessment, reach her own conclusions, and communicate those conclusions to the Kaveth hunting pack in a language the Kaveth understood far better than any language I could speak. I found the Xenobiology compact in my kit bag that evening, in the transit accommodation I had booked for the layover, and I read the Kaveth entry with considerably more attention than I had given it before. It was not a long entry. The compact was organized for quick reference, not for comprehensive study, but it was specific about several things I had not known. The first was the jaw strip color state system, which was more nuanced than the simplified version I had gotten in the threat assessment briefing. The briefing had given me 3 states. The compact gave me 8. The pale state I had observed, recognition pale, the compact called it, was 7th in the sequence. Below it were the 6 states that covered the full range of predation approach and territorial assertion. Above it was only 1 state, which the compact described as the color a Kaveth jaw strip produces in the presence of an entity the pack's instinctive hierarchy cannot locate a position for. The 8th state, beyond recognition. The compact said this state had been documented only 17 times in recorded xenobiology literature, and that 12 of those instances had involved other Kaveth. I did not know what the other 5 had involved. The compact entry did not say. The second thing the compact told me, which I had not known, was that Kaveth packs maintain their preselection hierarchy through a combination of sense signature reading, pupil dilation assessment, and what the compact called metabolic confidence analysis. The last of these was the most significant. Metabolic confidence, as the compact explained it, is the specific biochemical profile produced by an animal that has never, in its evolutionary or personal history, experienced the kind of sustained threat response that produces chronic stress chemistry. Not an animal that is currently unafraid. An animal that is constitutively unafraid. One whose baseline metabolic state does not include the apparatus of prey fear, because the architecture of the prey fear response was never built in. The Kaveth assessment hunter had read this in Pip. In her scent, probably, I cannot smell what she smells or know what her biochemistry presents to a species calibrated to read it. But also in her posture, in the movement of her eyes, in the specific quality of her attention. The way she watched without any of the alertness as fright that prey animals produce. The way her body settled when she committed her attention to something, rather than tightening. The way she held eye contact with something 4 times her size that had been built by millions of years of evolution to be the last thing most animals ever see, and simply continued to look at it with the same patient, cataloging interest she gave to everything else in her ledger. Border Collies are a working breed, not working in the way that working dogs for human law enforcement are working. That is a different kind of working, a specific training built on top of a specific temperament. Border Collies are working in the older sense, the original sense. They were developed over centuries of careful selective breeding on the hill farms of Britain and Ireland and the upland stations of the southern hemisphere to manage animals many times their own size. To hold a herd, move it, split it, stop it, turn it, using nothing but presence and eye contact and the specific quality of attention that says, at a level below language and below deliberate communication, I have complete information about everything within my awareness and I have already decided how this ends. No aggression, no display. Just the knowledge, communicated by the entire posture and chemistry and gaze of the animal, that you are dealing with something that has been doing this longer than you have been alive and has never, not once, been uncertain about the outcome. Think about what that means for a moment. A border collie working a flock of sheep is not herding with its body in the way a drover herds with a stick. It is herding with its mind. With the precise communication of a mental state, I know where you all are. I know what you are thinking of doing. I know where you are going to go before you go there. And you know that I know, delivered so completely and so continuously that the herd responds to it the way iron filings respond to a magnet. Not because the dog is physically compelling them. Because the dog's absolute certainty about the situation is more authoritative than any physical force available. This is what the Kaveth assessment hunter had encountered. Not a small dog, not a prey animal of manageable size. An animal whose entire evolutionary and selective breeding history had been organized around the precise, total management of situations. An animal that was constitutively calm in exactly the way that the compact described, not as a trained behavior, not as a suppressed stress response, but as the baseline operating state of a nervous system that had been built over centuries of deliberate human selection for exactly this, to be more certain than anything else in the room. It does not matter how large you are. The Kaveth assessment hunter was shoulder height to a tall human, which made it approximately 3 times Pip's size at the shoulder. It did not matter. The hierarchy being communicated to it was not a hierarchy of size. It was something older and more fundamental. It was the hierarchy of an animal that has never, in the entire span of its existence, needed to be afraid of the question in front of it. The compact used the phrase metabolic confidence, and I thought, sitting on the bed in the transit accommodation with Pip asleep against my ankle, that this was probably the most accurate technical phrase I had ever read and also the least adequate one. Metabolic confidence. Yes, and also the look in her eye when she decided something needed her attention. The way she walked into a new field on the first morning and had it organized by noon. The way she had looked at the Survey Corps officer in the briefing room all those years ago and told me, without a word, that the officer's threat waiting was wrong. The complete, unhurried, total presence she brought to every single thing she looked at. That was not something I had trained into her. That was not something my daughter had trained into her. That was something Pip had arrived with, at 6 months old, already present, and already doing what it was going to do for the next decade. I had simply been the geography that let it make itself visible. On level 2 of Kaveth Junction, it had made itself visible to a Kaveth hunting pack. And the pack had read it the way they read everything, precisely, completely, and without the ability to misunderstand what they were looking at. The next 40 hours on Kaveth Junction were not interesting. That is the truth of long transit layovers. They are mostly not interesting. You find a routine and you hold to it and you move through the hours the way you move through administrative paperwork, systematically, without particular feeling, noting what requires notation and setting aside what doesn't. This is not a complaint. I have spent the better part of my adult life in environments that were not designed for human comfort or human timescales, and I have learned to be at peace with the hours that are simply hours. You eat, you sleep, you work on what needs working on, you wait. I found the food concession I had spotted from the bench and ate at it twice a day for the duration of the layover. The proprietor was a Sathi, a species that runs about 3/4 height to a tall human, bilateral, with an extra elbow joint in each arm that takes some getting used to when you watch them prepare food. The food she prepared was good. A pressed flatbread with something fermented inside it that I cannot name in any human language but that tasted like sourdough had been persuaded to develop ambitions. I ate 6 of them over the course of the layover. I tipped well. She noticed Pip on the second visit, and after a careful few minutes of observation, offered Pip a plain flatbread with nothing on it, which Pip accepted with the precise dignity of an animal that understood it was receiving hospitality and intended to honor it. I worked through the permit paperwork. The supplemental amendment that Clause 9 required turned out to be a 4-page form that referenced 3 other forms, one of which was no longer in current use, and had a successor form filed in a completely different section of the resettlement registry. It took 11 hours to locate all the correct forms and complete them accurately. I am good at paperwork. Survey Corps is, despite the romanticized versions of it that show up in entertainment media, substantially a paperwork operation. You survey a location. You document what you found. You file the documentation in a manner consistent with the relevant regulatory framework. 22 years of this develops an aptitude. Pip slept beside me during the paperwork sessions, on the bench when we were on the concourse, on the floor mat I had brought for exactly this purpose when we were in the transit accommodation. She snored very slightly when she was fully asleep, a small, rhythmic sound that I had been listening to for 9 years and that had become, in the way that background sounds become background, simply part of what silence sounded like. Silence that didn't include it felt incomplete. I saw the Kaveth once more during the layover. 3rd day, mid-morning, level 2 again, a different configuration this time, 3 individuals rather than 4, moving along the far concourse wall toward the cargo processing ramps. They were not moving in a hunting configuration. They were moving in what I would have called transit mode, compact, purposeful, not spreading their attention across the room. Going somewhere specific. I watched them cross my field of vision and disappear past the cargo ramps. Pip had tracked them from the food concession bench. Head up, chin off her paws, the specific attentive posture of active cataloging. When they cleared the far end of the concourse, her head came down again. The Sathi proprietor, refilling my water without being asked, said something in her own language. I don't speak Sathi. She seemed to understand this and switched to the standard trade language most of the concourse species used. The Kaveth, she said, a statement, not a question. Yes, I said. Yesterday also, she said. 2nd shift, not here, cargo level. She paused, she looked at Pip. They were here before your animal, not now. I thought about how to answer that. Probably a coincidence, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at Pip. Then she put 2 more flatbreads on my tray without charging me for them and went back to the preparation area without another word. I ate the flatbreads. The thing is, and this took several more hours of sitting on the bench, working through permit forms and occasionally letting my mind settle into the unfocused attention that produces thoughts you weren't planning on having. The thing is that what happened on that bench was not really about the Kaveth. The Kaveth were the visible part of it, the part I could describe in sequence and have another person follow. They were not the thing I kept coming back to. What I kept coming back to was the moment Pip's head came up. I had not given her a signal. I had folded the permit paperwork, a single small reflexive motion, the way you put your hand on a doorframe when a sound starts in the next room, and Pip had read it the way she read everything, completely, immediately, with full understanding of what it meant. She had known, before I had consciously formulated my own assessment, that the situation had changed, and that the change required active monitoring rather than passive monitoring. She had adjusted. And she had made her own assessment, and communicated it to the Kaveth hunting pack in a language I could not speak, and they could not misread. 9 years. She had been doing this for 9 years, and I had been watching it, and I still did not have an entirely clear picture of what she was paying attention to at any given moment, or how the picture she built from it compared to the picture I built from the same raw material. I knew that her picture was more complete. This had been demonstrated more times than I had kept count of. The horses she had known were about to bolt before they bolted. The storm front she had oriented on before I had noticed the pressure change. The Survey Corps officer with the error in his threat waiting, whom she had watched from the moment he walked into the briefing room, whose specific inadequacy she had communicated to me in her way, which I had translated into my way and acted on, and which had been validated 6 months later by the review board's finding. I had never been entirely certain how much of this was Pip's genuine independent assessment and how much was my own instinct finding an acceptable exterior expression through her. This is a question I had been sitting with for 9 years and had decided, eventually, was not actually important. The outcome was the outcome. The accuracy rate was what it was. Whether the mechanism was Pip reading the environment with some sensory apparatus I didn't share, or Pip reading me and reflecting my own unprocessed conclusions back in a form I could act on, or some combination of the two, it resolved the same way every time. It closed the question. On level 2 of Kaveth Junction, the question had been closed again. Gate 9 on the upper concourse processed, boarding at 6:40 on the 5th day. I got there at 6:10, old habit. Pip had been awake and ready since 5:40, which I knew because at 5:40 she had stood up from the floor mat, turned in a precise circle, and sat looking at the transit accommodation door with the focused expectancy she reserved for situations where something was about to happen, and she had already done everything necessary to be ready for it. The gate was not busy. An early departure on a small transit vessel to an outer corridor station tends not to attract crowds. There were perhaps a dozen travelers waiting, a mix of species I could mostly identify, nobody I recognized from the concourse, nobody in any configuration that read as coordinated attention. I found a seat in the gate waiting area. Pip sat beside my left boot. I read the supplemental amendment forms for the 4th time to make sure everything was in order. It was in order. A young merit woman, different from the registry clerk, younger, first posting, you can always tell by the way they hold their tablet, came by to validate boarding permits. She stopped at mine. She looked at the companion registry stamp. She looked at Pip. "This is a Border Collie," she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at Pip for another moment. Pip looked back at her with the calm, complete attention she gave to everything. "My instructor at the academy," the young woman said slowly, feeling her way toward the end of the sentence, "told us that Earth companion animals were on the apex taxonomy list. I thought she was," She stopped. I thought she was exaggerating for emphasis. She wasn't exaggerating, I said. She said the small ones were another stop. She said the size doesn't track. It doesn't track, I agreed. The young woman looked at Pip for another moment with the specific expression of someone whose classroom instruction has just become real in a way she had not been prepared for. Then she stamped the permit with slightly more care than was probably required and moved on down the row. Pip's tail made the small side-to-side movement. Not a full wag, just the steady, even rhythm of a dog who has updated the ledger on a new encounter and found nothing in it that required further action. I clipped her leash in preparation for boarding. She stood with the immediate cooperative readiness she always had for the leash, not straining, not sitting down in protest, simply standing with it attached in the way that she understood a leash to mean we are going somewhere together, and she had no particular objection to that. The boarding call came across the transit PA in 3 languages. I picked up the kit bag. Pip fell in at my left heel without being asked. She had always done this. Since the first day I had her, 6 months old, already knowing things I had not taught her, already moving with the unhurried certainty of an animal that has been born knowing how things are organized and simply needs the geography to make itself available. She walked at my left heel on the loading ramp, through the docking connector, down the vessel's boarding corridor. She settled in the assigned seat compartment, a small area partitioned for companion animals near the forward cabin, with the composed patience of someone who had done this before and found it unremarkable. I stowed the kit bag in the overhead compartment. I sat down. The transit vessel disengaged from Kaveth Junction's docking collar with a sound like a lock clicking open, which was not technically what was happening but was what it sounded like, and the forward viewer showed the station receding against the star field. The lights of Level 2 were not visible from this angle. The concourse where we had sat for 4 days, where the Kaveth had made their approach and revised their assessment and walked away, was already behind us and becoming background. I thought about the 41 incidents and the 17 formal complaints and all the diplomatic apparatus that had been running for 3 years. I thought about the transit authority log and the gap that was going to appear in it starting from mid-shift on the day we had arrived, and how nobody reviewing that log was going to be able to explain the gap in terms of any intervention they had made or any personnel they had deployed. The gap would simply be there. A period of several days in which the Level 2 incident metrics had run clean, and then a period in which the Kaveth appeared to have redirected their transit patterns to corridors where Pip and I were not present. I thought about what it would look like in the Transit Authority's quarterly review. A senior analyst somewhere would note the anomaly, would file it under unexplained variance, would add a footnote suggesting additional monitoring, would not, in all likelihood, identify the mechanism, because the mechanism was an 11-year-old Border Collie on a civilian companion transit permit, and there is no category in a transit authority's incident response framework for that. I also thought about the Sathai proprietor and the 2 flatbreads she had put on my tray without charging me. That acknowledgement, silent and practical, had pleased me more than any official notation would have. She had seen what she had seen. She had drawn her own conclusion. She had acted on it in the precise, understated way that a person acts when they have understood something correctly and wish to honor it without making a production of it. That was the right way to handle it. I respected it. I looked down at Pip. She was curled in the compartment, her chin on her front paws, her eyes at half-mast in the transitress posture, not asleep, not fully awake, monitoring at reduced resolution because the environment did not currently require more than that. The gray on her muzzle was substantial now. Her left rear knee would bother her in the morning if the vessel ran cold. She was 11 years old. She had looked at a Kaveth hunting pack on Level 2 of one of the busiest transit hubs in the outer corridor network, and she had told them, without a single sound, exactly how the hierarchy was organized. And they had understood her. Not because she had threatened them, not because she had displayed, not because she had done anything that would register as aggression on any behavioral scale I was aware of. Simply because she was what she was, and the Kaveth assessment hunter had been precise enough to read it, and what it had read had produced the 8th jawstrip state, the state for which the compact had only 17 documented instances in all of recorded xenobiology. I am not a man who believes in the word just. It does a great deal of damage in how people think about things. Just a dog, just a pet, just an animal. These are not descriptive statements. They are errors of categorization dressed up to sound like precision. Pip was not just anything. She was an 11-year-old Border Collie with a gray muzzle and a trick knee and 9 years of uninterrupted, comprehensive attention applied to the project of making sure the world was organized the way it was supposed to be organized. She had been doing this since she was 6 months old, and she had not stopped, and she was not going to stop. The transit vessel settled into its corridor heading. The stars shifted their angles in the viewer. Pip's tail made one slow side-to-side movement. Then it stilled. She was done with Kaveth Junction. It had been noted. It had been filed. The entry was closed. Whatever came next on Vethara Station would get its own page in the ledger, and she would attend to it the same way she attended to everything, completely, without hurry, and without the slightest uncertainty about how it was going to go. I pulled the permit paperwork out of the kit bag for the 5th time. Clause 9 still had the carve-out. The supplemental amendment still needed to be filed when we arrived. Nothing about this had changed. I made another marginal note and put the paperwork away. Outside the viewer, the corridor ahead was dark and wide and entirely ordinary, which was all I had ever asked of it. Pip slept. The galaxy, as it had always done, continued.